Good morning. So the first day of a new schedule for us, because we've almost always had class before worship in the past, but I think that this will work out well, and I think that we'll get more people in class too, especially children. I know when I taught teenagers, they weren't always there promptly at 10 a.m., so this might be better for them. I was putting it mildly. For the rest of this, we only have half of our usual teaching quarter from now till the end of May. I have a topic that will fit in there pretty well that I'm pretty excited about. And to give credit where credit's due, I'm teaching from a book that has been called Too Good to Be False. You've heard the phrase too good to be true. This is about the character of Jesus, that the character of Jesus is too good to be made up, so to speak. In biblical studies, some of the more liberal scholars will say that, or even outright skeptics will say that Jesus was just a teacher, and then after he died, by the time they wrote these Gospels, they started to embellish and claim that he was God and so on. But if we look at the character of Jesus as revealed in the Gospels, we see a number of characteristics that are unlike any other ancient leader or teacher of any kind. So the first thing we're going to get out of the study is a deeper appreciation for the character of Jesus, because sometimes when you've been in church a long time, you take certain things for granted. You've read certain passages many times, and you need to be reminded not to take certain things for granted. We need to be reminded how different Jesus Christ is and how different Christianity is. But the other thing that we'll gain is we'll know that there's only one possible explanation for how such a unique character could exist. Since there was nothing like him before, there's nothing that any human writer could use as a basis for embellishment or imitation. The best explanation for why there's such a unique character is that he existed just like this, just like revealed in the Gospels with this character. So first part of this class, the first few weeks, we're going to take a deep look into 7 character traits of Jesus. We'll do a couple of them each week. And we'll gain some appreciation of his character. And after we've done that, we'll return to this concept. What does it mean for Jesus Christ to have such a different character than any other ancient teacher or leader or hero or mythological figure or anything else? What could it mean besides he was who he said he was? The first characteristic we'll look at is love. Now, in a church context, we might think, well, that's not so novel. We hear about love all the time. We preach it, we teach it, we talk about Jesus' love. We talk about how Jesus' love led him to the cross. But we take for granted how novel that is. In ancient religions, they did not talk about love. No ancient Greek said, Zeus loves me, and so I love Zeus back. Or Baal, or Egyptian gods, or Babylonian gods, or anything else. Gods were appeased. If you didn't want them to zap you, you didn't want them to kill you with a flood or an earthquake, or if you wanted something good from them, you wanted a good crop, then you tried to appease them. Maybe if you offered sacrifices to Baal, he would send rain on your crops or something. But there wasn't any concept that he loved you. You know, that just wasn't part. There wasn't, I have a relationship with Zeus. Or, you know, there's nothing of that. So we take for granted sometimes how novel this was. When you think about ancient hero stories, you've heard like Hercules, whatever. Do you hear anything about how he loved? No, it's just these mighty deeds he accomplished. There is no love that's at the center. And we see that because the power that Jesus had did not corrupt his love. The power, the incredible power that Jesus had, was used only for other people and to serve God, not for his own purposes. Could you pass that test? If you had infinite power, would you never use it for your own ends? I would fail that test pretty quickly. Would you be so in control of yourself that you would only use power for others? But that's how Jesus was. You might have heard there's a famous quote from Lord Acton in the 19th century that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's kind of a law of human nature. Abraham Lincoln, at about the same time, said, a lot of men can handle adversity. If you want to find out about a man's character, give him power. Because power does tend to corrupt human beings. But read through the Gospels from front to end. Where was Jesus ever corrupted by his power? Where did he ever use it for his own selfish purposes? He only used the power that he had to love others. Another 19th century theologian, William Paley, wrote about Jesus, and he said, neither as represented by his followers nor as attacked by his enemies is Jesus ever charged with any personal vice. This faultlessness is more peculiar than we're apt to imagine. Some stain pollutes the morals or the morality of almost every other teacher who ever lived and of every other lawgiver. Even Moses sinned. Even Moses did the wrong thing, didn't he? Moses was punished by God and wasn't allowed to enter the promised land because he took glory for himself before the people when it belonged to God on one occasion. Though this is, in fact, very unusual. Let's take a look at a couple of examples of his love. In Matthew chapter 9, starting in verse 35. And Jesus went throughout all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every disease and every affliction. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them, because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. Jesus wanted his mission accomplished to reach out into these fields of harvest that he saw because he had compassion for those people. In one of the great compassion stories of Jesus, we find in Luke chapter 11, Jesus and his apostles were walking from town to town, his disciples. And it says, starting in verse 11 of Luke 7, soon afterward he went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a great crowd went with him. As he drew near to the gate of the town, behold, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and a considerable crowd from the town was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, do not weep. This is an accidental meeting in a sense. They were traveling from town to town. Jesus couldn't raise everyone from the dead who died. He couldn't heal everyone who had a sickness. But what was in front of him moved his compassion. And what was in front of him was a widow whose only son had died. Now, in an agricultural society, she needed her husband to work the farm. And then when he died, she needed her only son to work the farm. And now he's died. And if she has no other relatives to go live with, she will likely become a beggar. There's no life insurance policy in these days. People lived on the edge financially. Jesus, of course, understood this. He heard what was happening with this funeral, that this was a widow's only son. Then he came up and touched the bier, and the bearer stood still, and he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." And the dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. That was just an act of love. Most of his miracles had many witnesses, and the miracles served the purpose of getting large crowds to pay attention to the gospel message that he was teaching. He couldn't heal everybody, and he couldn't raise everybody from the dead. That wasn't the purpose of his miraculous work. The miracles accompanied the mission. The miracles said, hey, this is God's message, listen to it. But in this case, there was, I don't know how big a crowd, not too big, from a very small town, as they were in those days. That wasn't the point. The point was he had compassion. He saw a widow whose only son had died, and he was moved. And then, of course, we have the famous story in John 11 of the death of Lazarus. And as we all memorized as children, what's the shortest verse in the Bible? Jesus wept, John 11:35. Jesus saw how much Mary and Martha were distraught over the death of Lazarus. He knew that he was about to raise Lazarus from the dead, but he didn't have the attitude, therefore there's nothing to worry about here. He was still moved to tears because he connected with people and loved them. And he used the power residing in him as the Son of God incarnate to help the people he was moved to help, not to help himself. But of course, the greatest example of Jesus' love, he gave his own life, and he did it voluntarily. Now, there are many people who have risked their lives. But risk means it's not absolutely certain. If you sign me up for the military, you'd say, now there's a risk that you'll die. But no one's told, please sign up for the Army and we can guarantee you within the next 2 years you'll be dead. No, nobody signs up for that. There are amazing things that are done of people risking their lives, and there are amazing things in which people even give their lives for their fellow soldiers. But Jesus signed up for it voluntarily. Not only that, this is kind of an interesting perspective from the book. Jesus is the only man who ever gave his consent to be born into this world. In India, a few years ago, there was a lawsuit where a man was trying to sue his parents, claiming, I didn't ask to be brought into this world. I didn't give my consent. The judge in India was not impressed with the argument. The lawsuit didn't go anywhere. Well, Jesus did give his consent. Jesus is in the bliss of heaven and volunteers to come suffer on earth. There is no ancient leader, no ancient religious figure where any of this could be said of them. So the love of Jesus that sometimes we take for granted because we've taught it so much, we've heard it so much in church, this is unique. This is powerful. This is beyond anything else anywhere in the ancient world or today. But let's take a look at a second attribute of Jesus, his brilliance. Jesus gets it right every time. When you read through the Gospels, sometimes it strikes you. Have you ever had that moment in life when you thought of the perfect answer about an hour later, or when it's too late? That doesn't seem to happen to Jesus, does it? Jesus comes up with the perfect answer right then. He gets it right every time. One of my favorite examples was one that when I was a teen, I just didn't understand it at all because it doesn't follow the proper rules of debate, and it just doesn't seem fair what Jesus did, and it took me a long time to really understand it. One version of it is in Mark chapter 11, beginning in verse 27. One of the many, many times when he's challenged by Jewish leaders and he has to respond to them on the spot. Starting in verse 27 of Mark 11, and they came again to Jerusalem, and as he was walking in the temple, the chief priests and the scribes and the elders came to him, and they said to him, "By what authority are you doing these things? Or who gave you the authority to do them?" Jesus said to them, "I will ask you one question. Answer me, and I'll tell you by what authority I do these things. Was the baptism of John from heaven or from man? Answer me." And they discussed it with one another, saying, "If we say from heaven," he will say, "Why then did you not believe him? But shall we say from man?" They were afraid of the people, for all the people held that John really was a prophet. So they answered Jesus, "We do not know." And Jesus said to them, "Well, neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things." Now, when I first came across this passage when I was young, everything seemed wrong about it. I mean, first of all, somebody asks you a question. What do? You give them an answer, right? Jesus said, well, okay, well, first, even though you've asked first you've got to answer my question. Now, that just seems all wrong. That doesn't seem fair. And the story ends without Jesus ever having answered their question. So what in the world is going on here? But then I realized Jesus is doing something that only he could do. Jesus knew their hearts. He could see what was in their intent. And this is a way for Jesus to say, basically, are you asking questions because you actually want to understand truth? You actually want an answer? Or are you asking questions to start a fight with me, to trap me, and so on? And we can answer that by testing you. I'll give you a question. What about John the Baptist? If you have an interest in truth, you won't be afraid to take a stand on that question. So demonstrate to me that you care about the truth. Answer this simple question. Where did John the Baptist's teaching come from? And then I'll tell you where mine comes from. Well, what happened? They didn't want to take a stand. They were afraid. If we say this, that's a problem. If we say that, that's a problem. So we'll just say, oh, we don't know. Now, Jesus wasn't trained by philosophers, and he never followed a rabbi, but actually in ancient literature, there is something kind of like this. It's not something you'd expect a carpenter's son from Galilee to know, but philosophers in the Greek world had this happen to them occasionally, that some clever student asks a question, and the point of the question is not to get an answer. The point of the question is, ha ha, I bet I've stumped you. And philosophers learned to say, instead of answering the question, say, why did you ask that question? What difference will the answer mean to you? And that's essentially what Jesus is doing here. He was never trained in Athens. He was just a carpenter's son. Well, how could a carpenter's son be this brilliant? How could he refute in the temple courtyard the chief priests and the scribes? These are the people who sat around for hours every day discussing and debating and memorizing scripture and so on. They were educated in this and they were trained in debate. How does a carpenter's son stand them on their heads? How's that possible? But he saw through his opponents. And so he reacted in a different way than any other human being who feels obligated to answer a question and to follow the proper debating rules. And in fact, Jesus often does this kind of thing. Answers a question with a question. Or answers a straight question, not with a straight answer, but with a parable. And we'll get to that too. Another way in which Jesus' brilliance is unparalleled is human teachers grow and mature. Right? Ask any preacher you know, how do your sermons today compare to the first sermon you ever gave? And they'll say, oh, the first sermon I ever gave, I would never be like that again. I've moved way beyond that. What's the first lengthy sermon recorded for Jesus? The Sermon on the Mount. That's pretty good for a beginner, isn't it? Jesus doesn't demonstrate growth in his brilliance. He doesn't really demonstrate growth as a teacher. He's the perfect teacher at the beginning of his ministry and 3.5 years later at the end. Even when you read about the lives of the great philosophers, that's not the case. Because a normal human being learns and grows and gets better over time. Jesus is at the 100% level for 3.5 years. Even if, as skeptics say, even if gospel writers were to try to embellish the story of Jesus, it would be hard not to leave behind traces of the truth. And in this case, they would leave behind traces of Jesus' growth. We would pick through, but read between the lines and say, oh, look, this is early Jesus. This is early Jesus before he got really good at teaching such and such. That's not the case. In the Gospels, from start to finish, Jesus is the perfect teacher with the right answer every time. He also produces unexpected answers that are tailored to the particular person. Nicodemus comes in John chapter 3 to visit him at night, and Jesus comes up with statements like you must be born again that are baffling to Nicodemus. But it was what Nicodemus needed to hear. That's exactly the way in which he needed to be challenged. But on the other hand, when the rich young ruler comes to Jesus, what must I do? Jesus looks into his heart and says, well, he needs to be challenged in a different way. And so Jesus says, well, sell what you have, give it to the poor, and start following me around. Because he knew that's the way that particular man needed to be challenged. It's not what he said to everybody. There's an amazing story that even people who aren't believers have commented on in Matthew chapter 22. Starting in verse 16. The Pharisees went and plotted how to entangle him in his words, and they sent their disciples to him, along with the Herodians, saying, Teacher, we know that you're true. Here comes the flattery part before they try to challenge him. Teacher, we know you're true and teach the way of God truthfully. You don't care about anyone's opinion. You're not swayed by appearances. So tell us then what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Oh boy, they think they've got a real trap set, because they think that if he swears any allegiance to Caesar, he's going to lose his Jewish followers. But if he says something against Caesar, they can take that to the Roman authorities, have him put to death, So Jesus comes up with the answer, not an hour later. Aware of their malice, he says, "Why put me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the coin for the tax." And they brought him a denarius, and Jesus said to them, "Whose likeness and inscription is this?" They said, "Caesar's." And then he said to them, "Therefore, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And when they heard it, they marveled, and they left him and went away. This passage, separating the earthly realm and the spiritual realm, recognizing that there is a civil government, it has its sphere of authority. That's okay by us. But there's also a spiritual realm that the civil authority does not interfere in. This is profound and continues to the present day. Our understanding, just this little short story, our understanding of how we relate to the world comes from this on-the-spot answer for this situation. Jesus never deliberates. He seems to know the answer instantly. I've never known a teacher like that. In fact, it's dangerous for us to try to imitate Jesus. What would Jesus do has its limits. I can't be Jesus. If somebody asks me a good question when I'm teaching a class, oftentimes the best thing for me to do as a teacher is to say, "You know what, that is a really good question. I'm going to make a note of it here, and next week we're going to start out, after I've had a week to look into it, we're going to start out answering that question." Because some of the worst answers are given off the top of your head. I've heard some of the worst religious answers when you try to be Mr. Answer Man who knows everything, because you don't know everything. And you give bad answers that actually harm other people's faith, because they go away thinking, "I'm not convinced. That sounded pretty weak." You would have been better off to come back later. Jesus doesn't go through some process of deliberation and let me go study that, let me figure that out, That's not the way he teaches. And finally, his brilliance is demonstrated in the poise that he has when he deals with these challenges. Mark chapter 3. The miracle stories at the beginning of Mark 2 and Mark 3 are some of my favorites, and we're going to look at them in these weeks. Mark 3 begins, again, he entered the synagogue, and a man was there whose hand was withered. The way that's phrased in the Greek, well, I don't know what withered means, but obviously the hand is worthless. It doesn't work. And the way his hand was withered is literally the Greek. It doesn't mean he was born that way. Something happened to him in life. Imagine if you get used to your hands working and then something happens and doesn't work anymore. Jesus, as you can expect, would have compassion on someone who had suffered that. But what's the attitude of the synagogue leaders? And they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come here." Well, what's about to happen? The normal way this script would play out would be Jesus would heal the man, and then they would all jump on him for healing him on the Sabbath. The people who were over there on the sidelines taking pot shots at the people who were actually out on the field of play, Jesus is supposed to do something, and now we can criticize him. We can take our shots at him, but Jesus doesn't handle it that way. Instead, before he does anything or makes any promise to the man, he turns to them and says, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm? to save life or to kill. This kind of reminds us of the other story. Take a stand. Where's John the Baptist's teaching come from? Take a stand. He wants them to take a stand right now. It says, but they were silent. Nobody really wants to speak up in advance before the man has been healed and say, please don't heal that man. Nobody wants to be that person. But they were planning to be that person after the fact. Wait until he's healed, and now we'll start piling on Jesus. Somehow that would be okay. But Jesus embarrassed them. He said, okay, take a stand. You tell me, before I do anything, you tell me what's allowed on the Sabbath. Well, they didn't want to make a stand and come out and say it. So they were silent. And he looked around at them with anger. He had a righteous anger. But he had other emotions. It says he was grieved at their hardness of heart. So he's got anger. He's got a godly sorrow. But he also has compassion for the man. So these are all mixed together. He has to handle them all at once. He said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out and his hand was restored. What happens? Do they appreciate his brilliance? Well, it says the Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. Don't ever imagine that people will appreciate you being right and them being wrong. Their response wasn't, wow, Jesus asked us a question that we have no answer to. So this should cause some introspection. This should cause us to stop and think. Why are we this way, and why don't we have an answer for him? Instead, Jesus asked a question that they have no answer for, and their reaction was, in that case, we hate you even more than we already did. There's something about human nature being revealed here that isn't too pretty. By asking them a question that they couldn't answer, in a sense, he had shamed them in that culture publicly. And that shame, that embarrassment, dominated their minds. Not any concern for truth, not any concern to be challenged to rethink their assumptions, or, gosh, he asked us a question that we don't have an answer for. Maybe we should think about this. All they had was their own little emotions. Well, Jesus had several different emotions at once, and he handled them all perfectly. He was angry at them for their hardness of heart. He had godly sorrow for their hardness of heart. And he had compassion for the man, and so he acted on that. This is, could you ever have that kind of poise to always do the right thing, even in the midst of the conflict, even in the midst of being antagonized by other people that you get mad at because of it? Among mortal men like the rest of us, if there's several emotions going on at once, one of them ends up dominating, and it's not always the best one. If you know people, you know that the best person to go be a comforter for someone else might not be the best one to go rebuke someone else, and vice versa. There's different personalities, different gifts. Jesus was the best at everything. But human virtue often leads to vice. The person who is the one you would choose to go deliver the rebuke might also have the weakness that he's a little too combative. He takes it to an extreme. The person who's the best to go be the comforter might not be the best at taking a stand when it's needed, because he's a little too conciliatory, and so on. Virtues and vices often have a relationship to each other. Just to leave us with one quote. Jesus, this was a theologian in 1908, Jesus was imaginative, full of poetry and music and beautiful literary devices and parables, but unlike human imaginative artistic people, he was never flighty. He was practical, hard-headed, but he wasn't dull, wasn't prosaic. He was courageous, but he was never reckless. He was prudent, but he was never a coward. He never went to one extreme or the other. He was unique, but he wasn't an eccentric. He was sympathetic, but never sentimental. He was religious, but he didn't ever slip into superstition. Not one of the enemies of Jesus was able, by unfairness or falsehood or hatred, to push Jesus into a hasty, angry word or an unrighteous mood. Jesus was so firmly poised that under the pressure of the most venomous vituperation that's ever been hurled against a man, like claiming he's operating on behalf of the devil, for example, he stood up unmoved, unmovable. His poise was divine. Would any of us react in those situations that way? So Jesus demonstrates here in these first two character traits, love and brilliance, something we don't read about from any other ancient figure. And those are just two of the seven we're going to look for. Children are done. Thank you for your presence. Thank you for your attention.